President Biden is offering a major concession to Republicans as he works to strike an infrastructure deal. In the latest round of talks with top GOP negotiator Senator Shelley Moore Capito, the president reportedly offered to keep intact the centerpiece of the 2017 Trump tax cuts. He'd do so by abandoning a proposal to increase the corporate tax rate from 21 to 28%. That has been a red line for Republicans. President Biden is spending Thursday at his home in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware, to celebrate the First Lady's 70th birthday. He is expected to pick up the negotiations with Senator Capito Friday. Despite the ongoing talks, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki suggested the administration is not banking on a deal, saying they're keeping their options open. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell is pushing for a smaller infrastructure package. On Thursday, he said Republicans are open to a slightly higher price tag than the $928 billion counteroffer they proposed last week.
We are talking to them about a more measured infrastructure package, considerably less than that, maybe $1 trillion, financed in part by the gas tax that we already collect, and then to try to repurpose some of this massive amount of money we're already sending down under the rescue package. If we can't reach a bipartisan agreement, I would expect the administration and the congressional Democrats to try to push through a very large package. But that will be extremely controversial because of the taxes they want to make a part of it.
The White House is looking at another drop in unemployment claims as evidence the U.S. vaccination program is kickstarting the economy. New jobless claims fell below 400,000 last week for the first time since March 2020. Hiring also went up. Data from payroll processing firm ADP says companies added 978,000 people to their payrolls in May. That is the biggest monthly increase since last June. The U.S. is close to being on track to reaching President Biden's goal for July 4th, 70% of U.S. adults with at least one vaccine shot. Because of that, the White House is moving forward on a promise to distribute doses worldwide.
The president has announced a U.S. commitment to sharing a total of 80 million doses by the end of June. So that's 25 million doses that will go out as soon as possible, very quickly. A number of those are going to even go out as soon as today.
The announcement comes as Mr. Biden prepares to make his first overseas trip as president. He heads to the UK next week to meet with Prime Minister Boris Johnson and Queen Elizabeth, the head of a G7 summit. Next, the president travels to Brussels for a NATO summit on June 14th. The trip concludes with a face-to-face meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Geneva. Nicole Killian, Mariana Sotomayor, and Sarah Westwood join me now. Nicole is a CBS News congressional correspondent. Mariana is a congressional reporter for The Washington Post. And Sarah is a political and investigative reporter for The Washington Examiner. Hello and welcome to you all. So Mariana, is the president's willingness to make major concessions on his infrastructure plan yielding results with Republicans? And how long might this go on for?
Well, the White House is hoping that it doesn't go much further than what it's already been taking. It's worth pointing out that even though Biden's concession, which is to potentially put aside a really big campaign promise, which is raising the corporate tax rate to 28% from the current 21%, that, of course, being a big Republican win in that 2017 Trump tax cut. Republicans don't want any of that touched. Biden now in this concession is essentially saying, I'll put that aside if you guys can come to the table and agree on this $1 trillion package. Instead, what I will do is try and raise and basically create a floor, a minimum tax rate of 15% for corporations that pay little to no taxes every year. He at least wants to establish that. As of right now, though, Republicans, as you heard Mitch McConnell say, are skeptical of this. McConnell also noted that many in his party don't want to raise any kind of taxes. So convincing them even on this potential concession could be difficult. Tomorrow, Friday, is going to be another pivotal point. We'll get a little bit more insight to see whether Republicans will come to the table on this. Of course, the lead here is Senator Shelley Moore Capito of West Virginia. She says that she's continuing to talk to those Republicans that are part of these negotiations and discussions. But of course, Democrats, both the White House and even Biden himself, has made clear that even with these concessions, as much as Democrats and he in particular want to strike a bipartisan deal, if Republicans really don't come to the table, they will move forward without their support. And it's worth remembering that there's not much time left on the legislative calendar in Congress for the rest of this year. So they have to get something done sooner rather than later.
That clock is ticking. So, Nicole, Senator Capito did brief other Republicans after her meeting with President Biden. How did that go?
Well, in Senator Capito's view, she obviously is going to continue those discussions with the president tomorrow, and she made clear that she did reiterate her desire to work with the president all this, although she also stressed that Senate Republicans have put forth a number of counteroffers already, and what's unclear about Friday is whether Senate Republicans will put forth yet another counteroffer. So that is one of the spaces and areas that we are watching. But to Mariana's point, I think Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell made pretty clear that on this issue of taxes, it simply is just a non-starter. And he said pretty bluntly that's just not going to appeal with our party. So that's why he is continuing to urge this, measured package, something that's smaller, something they can all agree to. Of course, Senate Republicans have also made clear that they strictly support things that fall under the scope of traditional infrastructure. So that's really what Senate Republicans are looking for coming out of these meetings, a very targeted package. But again, the White House has also made clear they do want this package to be broader in scope. So again, these next few days, including tomorrow, will be critical.
Meantime, Sarah, Vice President Kamala Harris is tasked with a growing portfolio, which now includes protecting voting rights. What are some of the challenges she faces, and how does this represent a break in tradition for the White House?
Well, unfortunately for Vice President Kamala Harris, who was just handed responsibility for getting voting reform legislation through Congress, this is kind of an unwinnable fight right now. Senator Joe Manchin, a Democrat, opposes the current bill S1 in the form that it's presently written. He says it's too broad, that some of the superfluous things such as campaign finance reform or redistricting should be taken out. It should just be a piece of voting rights legislation. So Democrats don't even have 50 votes. Progressives are agitating for Democrats to remove the filibuster to eventually get this voting rights bill passed. So Kamala Harris could be dragged into the very messy filibuster fight. And even on that, Senate Democrats, again, don't have 50 votes to get rid of the filibuster because Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin both opposed removing that. The problem is that President Biden was starting to face pressure from the left wing of his party to turn his attention to voting reform legislation. Democrats are arguing that some of the voting reforms that are being passed at the state level in red states are unfairly restricting voting rights, and that they need this piece of legislation in Congress to go through at the federal level to protect voting rights. And it's reflective of how Biden has conducted his entire presidency, that he's very disciplined. He's very focused on one or two things at a time. Right now, that's obviously the infrastructure package. It's his top legislative priority. It's where he's choosing to spend his political capital on Capitol Hill right now. And so in order to sort of get this off his plate and alleviate the pressure facing him right now, he's giving that to Kamala Harris. Very similar to what we saw in the first 100 days of his presidency, when that unexpected border crisis was putting pressure on Biden, but he wanted to focus on the COVID response. And so he put the border crisis in Kamala Harris's lap as well, so that he could continue to focus on the disciplined set of issues that he wanted to. It's a break with tradition because typically when we see presidents hand off thorny issues to their vice presidents, it's because the presidents may be less experienced in that area, and vice presidents do tend to be more seasoned. We saw that, for example, with President Obama handing off foreign policy and diplomatic issues in some cases to then Vice President Biden, because Biden had been chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and was more experienced there. But in this case, Kamala Harris, a lot less experienced than Biden. Biden is obviously extremely experienced in government, has decades in public service on his vice president, and yet he is putting these difficult issues to a vice president who has a lot less experience, and that is a sort of break from tradition.
Yeah, difficult issues, and as you know, Sarah, just incredibly complex. The border crisis, the voting rights issue, very, very challenging political issues. Nicole, let's turn to you. I want to ask you about Congressman Matt Gaetz, because today we learned that prosecutors are looking at possible obstruction of justice charges. He remains under investigation for alleged sex trafficking of a minor. What is the basis of the obstruction investigation?
Yeah, so this was all first reported by Politico, which CBS News has since confirmed that this potential obstruction of justice could be part of this inquiry into Matt Gaetz and this ongoing sex trafficking investigation. And so what it involves is a phone call that Matt Gaetz reportedly had with a witness, and this is a witness that he was introduced to through his associate, Joel Greenberg, who has since pled guilty to a number of crimes, including sex trafficking. And so there was this phone call that involved this witness and also Gaetz's ex-girlfriend, who reportedly is cooperating with federal authorities. And so that is the nature of this potential obstruction of justice inquiry. Now, a spokesperson for Matt Gaetz did issue a statement saying that Congressman Gaetz pursues justice. He doesn't obstruct it. The anonymous allegations have thus far amounted to lies wrapped in leaks rooted in an extortion plot by a former DOJ official. The statement goes on to say that after 2 months, there was still not a single on-record accusation of misconduct, and now the story is changing yet again. Representative Gaetz's legal team continues to investigate the attempted extortion of a sitting U.S. congressman and anyone who may be connected to it. So once again, Congressman Gaetz denying the accusations against him. I would point out, he has been up here on Capitol Hill, but has continued to evade reporters' questions about this ongoing investigation. And just earlier today, I spoke with Congressman Ted Lieu, who has been very vocal about calling for Matt Gaetz to step down off of the Judiciary Committee, simply because that is a committee that has oversight over the FBI, which is in the Justice Department, which is involved in this investigation for weeks, if not months now. Congressman Lieu has been calling for that, and once again telling me today he strongly feels that Congressman Gaetz should step down off of this committee, especially considering that the FBI director is expected to testify before this committee next week.
All right. Mariana, thousands of Dr. Anthony Fauci's work emails being made public is becoming the latest political battle. Why is that? And do the emails show anything different than what he presented publicly?
That's right. I think that whenever you're talking about Dr. Anthony Fauci, you see Democrats lining up to applaud him, and you see Republicans getting ready to just criticize him. And that's exactly what these new tranche of emails have caused. You've seen a number of Republicans very quickly take to Twitter or issue statements. You actually have Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, introducing legislation to fire Fauci. And that is more or less what these emails have caused on the Republican side. What we have seen from these emails, it hasn't really deviated from what he was saying at certain points in time, even though Republicans are categorizing this as smoking gun revelations. Some of these things that they say are smoking guns that, however, aren't necessarily that. You remember way back, even before we all entered lockdown, it was February 2020 when Fauci was speaking to someone in the administration, advising them that they don't have to wear a mask. And that was a position that he took at the time. And it was one that also President Trump took at the time, his reasoning being that, the masks may not prove to be that effective, but also they were worried that many people in the public would be buying these masks and preventing doctors from wearing them. So that is one point that Republicans are latching onto, saying that Fauci continues to make us wear masks and that is not something that necessarily should be done. There's also other points of consideration, like the fact that he, at the time, this is very early on again in the pandemic, where many people, many doctors and scientists kind of pushed aside this theory that the coronavirus stemmed from a lab in Wuhan. That, of course, is now something that is coming to light again, or at least that even the Biden administration is saying that there should be more investigations into. again, this isn't necessarily anything different that we have seen or that he has advised, but Republicans now really calling on Democrats to investigate Fauci, to bring him forward to a number of committees, including the Select Committee investigating how the government responded to the coronavirus. But given that Democrats very much have applauded Fauci throughout the course of the pandemic, it's unlikely that they will actually bring him forward to testify unless it's absolutely necessary.
Well, let's dig into this a little bit. Sarah, explain why conservatives are saying that these emails support a possible dismissal or downplaying of the COVID-19 lab leak theory.
Well, some of the most interesting emails in that tranche on that topic didn't come from Fauci himself. They came from some of the voices in the scientific community that have been most loudly downplaying the possibility that the virus could have escaped from a lab. There were two exchanges that conservatives have really focused in on. One was from a man named Peter Daszak. He's someone who steered some grants from the NIH, at least some funding to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, where the lab leak hypothesis has sort of centered on where the lab leak might have occurred. Obviously, we have no idea if that was the case, but there was an exchange where Peter Daszak wrote to Dr. Anthony Fauci thanking him for downplaying the possibility of a lab leak in public. There's bipartisan scrutiny right now on whether people like Daszak, like some other top voices in the field of virology and in the scientific community, perhaps intentionally misled the public about how likely a lab leak was. There are still two leading theories. There's evidence out there that both of them could be true. But there was a concerted effort in parts of the scientific community to make one of those theories sound a lot less likely. And that decision early last year is now being scrutinized because it was never really based on solid evidence. There was really no reason to rule that out when some scientists did. And obviously, scrutiny is falling on Fauci a little bit, on NIH, because of the fact that some funding did flow to that lab. And there are questions of conflicts of interest of people who have been downplaying the theory while also having been invested in that research. Republicans have really made Fauci the mascot for public health bureaucracy, for the scientific community. And so they want to blame him for all of the lockdowns and such. And so I think that also the timing of the emails coming out, just as public opinion is really coalescing around the idea that this really may have escaped from a lab, has also really heightened how intense the scrutiny on Fauci's emails was this week.
Right. Well, the fact that you have now the Biden administration tasking intelligence agencies to take a closer look at this would seem to be pretty telling of just how seriously now this is being looked at. Nicole Killian, Mariana Sotomayor, and Sarah Westwood, thank you all very much.